Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Dr. Caleb Wallwork. Let me write my name here. First name is James, but it's J.Caleb Wallwork. W-A-L-L. And videographer, you're coning in on this thing, right? I'm an MD. I'm not just some guy in a white coat. If the videographer will move back, and come back on me. I will give you more of my credentials in a separate video. I have so many things I need to talk about in this particular presentation that I don't have time to go into a lot of that. But I've got gray hair in my head. I was born in 1939. I don't mind telling people how old I am. I'll be 74 next month. The date on this is, what is today? Friday, 2013, 07/26 or 7. What is it? Anybody help me? 26. And it's about 5:20 p.m. Okay, we got the, Kathy, if you'd go down and get the Windex. I need to be able to clear this off. I need it right now. And if you'll back up a little bit, videographer, back to the back. The subject that we're talking about is one I call coma guard, or let's rephrase it. This is Journey into Diabetes / Mark. Let me go over here. Journey into Diabetes or / Mark code DIES, and that's an acronym. This code DIES is an acronym for the phrase coma guard or diabetic coma rescue service. Now, do we have a eraser? Yes, we have an eraser. Let's see how well we can get this off. I don't know, but I'm going to give it a try. Maybe we got. Do we have the Windex? And a rag. I'm going to need a rag too. What I'm attempting to do when I talk about journey into diabetes is take the audience, and if you'll go back to that position, who represent a wide range of people through a lecture, talk, speech. You got a rag? Okay. Okay, good. All right. Hopefully. Yes, it comes off very well. Hallelujah. Praise the flag. Okay. Wide range. There's the audience who are receiving this have a wide range of experience with diabetes. They're the type 1 diabetics who represent 1% of the population. And then there's the other 99%. And then there's about a 5 or 6% of the population who represent the people who have emotional ties to people who have developed diabetes. These smaller groups of people very well, perhaps, if not probably, know everything that I'm talking about here much better than I do. But we need to present all of this complex information to the wide scope of the population, because where I'm trying to go with all this it requires that there's a lot of people in the in the broader population who are going to have to change a number of things about the way they conduct their relationships to diabetes if the diabetic patients are going to benefit from this co-DIES program that I'm talking about. Now, diabetes can be divided, this whole subject can be divided into 4 boxes as I've thought about this. And I've been thinking about this for 5 or 6 months. You've probably figured out that I'm talking without any notes. And this is the best way to tie it all together. If we talk about 4 big blocks, and one of them, the top one, is blue, and the next one down is green, and I hope you can see the difference in colors, but you may not be able to. Sometimes those are chromatographically not as distinct, but I can still talk about them. The next one down is the yellow box, and at the bottom of this series is a red box. Okay. Now up here in this one, we're talking about, in order for people who know nothing about diabetes, they need to know these 2 first. And that is the biochemistry and physiology of diabetes. What happens to diabetics, why they have the problem they do. And the green box is the current state of the art of treating diabetes with various flavors of insulin. And if that sounds like an odd number, it really means that there's a lot of insulin out there which all does the same thing, but it does it at greater, sometimes faster onset and longer duration of action. Now, how does diabetes happen? I've drawn this. If you got a, and I'm not very good at drawing this kind of stuff, but if there's a person up here, and he's got a nose and a mouth and eyes, he eats food, and these are his arms, legs, and so forth. Every organism, every person, every animal needs all of his cells, particularly those in his brain cells, he has muscle cells, but they all need oxygen and sugar. And when this guy eats, the food goes down here into his stomach, and then it is absorbed out of the stomach, and actually it goes back over into the liver, but it winds up in the bloodstream. And if we've got a blood vessel, and I'll try to visualize this as a red pipe here, and we've got blood going through here, and then we've got muscle cells. I guess I'm going to have to go back with the blue, or all the cells of the body are like this blue. What does insulin do? All right, we're back. We had to change batteries. Insulin, how does insulin work, and where does it, what's the action? It comes from the pancreas, and the pancreas is an organ that's shaped about like this, and it's actually up here, just in behind the stomach. And it has 2 functions. Look back, point back at me, my face. It has 2 functions. It produces enzymes that break meat down into chemical chemistry, molecules that the body can pick up and absorb. But it also, in tiny little dots throughout the pancreas, it has a separate function, and these are called the islet cells of the pancreas, and they produce insulin. And these, pointed here, not at my face, when I'm writing on the board, look at the board, back up a little bit so they can see it better. These islet cells of the pancreas are the key to diabetes, because in normal non-diabetic patients, these things function as endocrine glands, and that means they sort of have a mind of their own. They can tell when the sugar is going up in the body, and they put out insulin, and insulin works right here, insulin, right here at the wall, at the cell wall, and the insulin allows sugar to move out of the bloodstream into the cell. Patients who have, and what's the natural history of diabetes? There was, prior to 1924, when people, the way they get in trouble is the islet cells die. And when the islet cells, they die for a number of reasons, some of which, probably most of the time, just there is a genetic predisposition to these things not being able to continue to function. And all the type 1 diabetics have no insulin production at all. Type 2 have some insulin production. But and by this type 1 and type 2 business, we need to tell you that type 1 was the first kind to be discovered, and the second, type 2, was the second. But the thing that can confuse you is most people, when they have diabetes, when it starts later in life, they start with type 2 and it progresses to type 1. Now that turns things around. Okay, so these islet cells of the pancreas have died. They're not producing insulin anymore. And what happens to the patient? The sugar in the blood fills up to 900 or 1,000 and does not get into the cells, either these cells or into the neurons in the brain. And that's my diagram of a neuron. And the absence of blood here is what kills the patient in the short run. And it killed them prior to 1924 when they discovered insulin from cows could be isolated and given to patients and they would survive. And since then, diabetic patients have been able to live fairly normal lives as long as they've got enough insulin and as long as they manage their diabetes correctly. On the other hand, insulin can be deadly if you give them too much. And I'm not sure if anyone knows why an overdose of insulin results in what I'm going to tell you happens. But my best way of describing it is probably say there are more muscle cells, point over here, than there are brain cells in the body. And if there's too much insulin on board, if there's plenty of insulin on board, then the muscle cells win out in the battle for the available sugar in the blood, and all the sugar winds up out in the muscle cells, and the brain is deprived again. In both cases, when the patient dies from diabetes, they die from low brain sugar. They either die there because they wind up with low brain sugar because there's no insulin, and the sugar and blood and the sugar is all out here in the bloodstream, but not getting into either kind of cell, or they've got too much insulin on board, and it's all winding up out here in the muscles, and the muscles are stealing all the sugar out of the blood, and the brain cells wind up shortchanged. Now that's the explanation up here of what happens in diabetes. Now, then you've got insulin, and the green box here tells you how people manage diabetes. And there are these various, the diabetics, here's where we come to the demo portion. And if my videographer will point down here, I'll show you. This is a diabetic kit, and it includes, I've had it open here, it includes a glucometer, which is a device for measuring blood sugar. And they work this way. Are you able to focus it pretty clearly? Mm-hmm. All right, these are strips which are sensitive. They have a lot of fancy chemistry involved in them, so that they take sugar, they detect sugar in blood, and have that sugar react with certain chemicals that are in these strips. And the strips, because you load them this way, and the blood comes in here at this end, goes through this chemical reaction, and these numbers that are coming up here are telling the diabetic that the machine is ready to accept blood. And I'm going to pull this thing out. If you don't, it only gets primed and is ready to work for a few seconds, and I need to, for my purposes here, I need to pull it back out. Now this is a needle, a lance driver, and the lance is this little device right here that has a tiny little spear on the end of it that draws blood, and you push it into this device here and then set it here, and it saves you from having to take that needle and punch it into your skin, because it is it's loaded in here with a spring that drives it, stabs you in the comes out of that little opening right there and draws blood. And the settings here allow the diabetic to choose how deeply he wants the needle to go in. Children need to go back here to these low numbers, 1, 2, and 3, because they got thin skin. But in my case, if I want to draw some blood and demonstrate this, and I've done this partly because I have a relative in our family who developed diabetes when he was 7 years old, and he's 10 years old now. And when it first happened, I decided I was going to stick my finger. I wound up doing it 3 times a day. I started out doing 4, but I did it for about a month in order to get a feel for just how bad it all is. And this is the way it works. You know, I got this thing loaded on 7. I got the syringe here. We're going in the side of the finger this way. Each time I pull that trigger, this thing is sticking me. And I'm doing this in order to show you, and see, I'm bleeding. Okay? And we're going to check the sugar. I could stick myself in the other finger just as well, but now we push this thing back in, wait for it to load, and when the little, that's C25, I think that has to do, that's telling you what kind of strip it's in, but when you see that flashing drop of blood, this thing is ready to measure your sugar, and you stick it on there, and the drop of blood went up in there, and it counts backwards. It's working, and in a second we're going to know what my sugar is, 101. Okay? And this is an activity that the diabetics do 4 to 6 times a day, and after they get through drawing their blood like that, then they have a needle and they can have their insulin in a little bottle like that. Actually, that's not an insulin bottle. I didn't have one to demonstrate here, but it shows what I'm talking about. Now I got to be careful. I don't want to get blood on this coat. But they stick the needle in here and calculate. The most important thing is they calculate the amount of insulin they need, push it in there, draw up exactly the right amount, and when they've got the right amount, they pull that thing out, and they stick themselves in various parts of their bodies. And I use this, demonstrate this right here. You pull this thing back, stick it in here, and pop it. And folks, I just did that, and it was not the end of the world. I think you can tell by my tone of voice. And I feel that a lot of people who learn about diabetes, as soon as they realize this is what the diabetics are having to do 4 times a day, it kind of shuts their brain off. It kind of blows their mind. The whole idea that they're having to stick themselves, having to give 4 to 6 shots a day, day in and day out the rest of their lives, they feel like that's an awful thing, and their minds turn off. But what I'm trying to tell you, what I really want you to pick up on, is the real hazard here is how much insulin they give. Whether they give this much or this much or this much, and because the amount of insulin that they're having to give, they are having to use their brains to substitute for the islet cells of the pancreas. And that's the burden of diabetes. That's part of it. Now, what's on the top end and the bottom end? We're going to use this eraser as a symbol for a bed. And we're going to use this log cabin, this bottle of syrup, which I've emptied out because it was a mess. But anyway, the diabetics live in a world with sugar on the top end and dead in bed on the bottom. Because if they if they underdo, and I'll get to this as hopefully as clearly as I can in a minute, if they underdo the amount of sugar that they need and let their sugars ride too high, then they subject themselves to the long-term problems of diabetes. And what is that? Both the sugar in the blood, the high sugars in the blood, which happen in diabetics unavoidably, because there's only a certain degree to which they can control their diabetes. If you and I, with normal islet cells of our pancreas, about as high as our sugar ever goes, about 120, and about as low as it ever goes is about 80. But now the poor diabetics have got a much wider range. My friend, close member of the family, when he was found to have diabetes at age 7, his blood sugar was 900. It was out the roof. And he was starting to go out of his head because his sugar wasn't getting into his brain. Now that they've got it under control, his endocrinologist is happy with sugars as high as 200 occasionally, because she's afraid of this bottom one where they can die from hypoglycemia from overdose of insulin. Now, I hope you're beginning to get a feel for the fact that this sliding up and down of the range of sugars that the diabetics have, if they go up and down together. There are some diabetics I've known in my practice who are so afraid of dying in bed that they just let their sugars ride at 250 or 300 and don't worry about it. There's a test called hemoglobin A1C that is a test of the overall average blood sugar. It's an excellent test, and it tells how well the diabetic's got his diabetes under control. And anything under 7 is pretty decent. Anything under 6 is about what normal non-diabetics do. But when diabetics are pushing themselves down to the low 6 range or high 5s, they're taking a chance on winding up dead in bed. Now, so that is the insulin. Now, we get down here to this yellow box here. And that's where we're going to talk about code dyes. There are actually three separate new ideas, new concepts that are in this box, which are an attempt to change the dilemma that the diabetics are in today. One of them is called the diabetes detecting dogs. And I got off onto this when I first heard about these dogs about 8 or 9 months ago. And you're wondering how in the world that happened. Well, I'm a physician and I've been in ERs, and probably 100 times in my career I've treated hypoglycemic patients come in the ER. They come in and they're like they're drunk they're very intoxicated. They're so intoxicated, or they have so low sugar in their brains that their brains aren't functioning, they don't know where they are. And you save their lives very quickly by starting an IV line, giving them sugar, and in less than 2 minutes, they wake up. Now they don't know where they are. And they're scared, because the last thing they remember, they were at home or someplace else. And now they're looking up from a gurney at a lamp light over their heads and people wandering all around them. And I've done it. And when they start waking up and start to cry, you say, pat them on the shoulder, you're okay, your blood sugar went too low, you're going to be fine. And that's the way you treat them. Somebody down in Australia or New Zealand came in an ER about 6 years ago like that. They treated him, put him in the hospital a day or two, and about the time they're getting ready to leave him, the family said, Doc, in the last day or two before he got sick like this, the dog was acting funny, acting strange, jumping on him, and wouldn't stay away from him. Do you suppose that dog knew he was getting into trouble? And in 25 words or less, the answer is yes. They did a lot of studies on them. They found out that there are certain dogs who can detect when patients are going into hypoglycemia. So I learned about it and this young friend of mine, his stage name is William. I use stage names in these videos because there are people out in the world whose stories need to be told to the wider world, but whose privacy is valuable and important and needs to be protected. Okay, so I mentioned this to William's mother. Her name is Melissa, and a month or two later, Melissa told me in another conversation, you know, I've been doing some research about those dogs. They're out there and they cost $20,000. Okay. Now, as soon as I realized that they had those dogs out there and people were going to all the trouble to train those dogs and sell them and teach people to use them in order to protect themselves from hypoglycemia, I began to think, is there anything we can do to do a better job? And that's where we come back to Coke dyes. Coke dyes, but before I come to that, I need to tell you about another thing, which I'm going to say is number 3. Number 3 is the Artificial Pancreas Project. And I need to... Artificial Pancreas Project. Okay. Now, what the Artificial Pancreas Project is, if this is somebody's chest, and he got some underwear on here, you know, that if diabetics have pumps that fasten onto the body in some place, they sometimes put them on a thigh or arm or any place else, but it's a tank, small tank of insulin, and it has a tiny little pump in it, and it pumps the insulin into their bodies so they don't have to stick themselves with this syringe. Okay? That's what the diabetic pump does. Now, they've also developed a device called, which I'm going to make green, called the continuous glucose monitor. The pumps work fairly well. They've been out 8 or 10 years or so. The CGM, continuous glucose monitor. That CGM is a newer device, much less reliable. But the Artificial Pancreas Project is an attempt, is a hope, or a dream, however you want to phrase it, which combines these two. Theoretically, if you've got a continuous glucose monitor, which is monitoring the sugar, it's also got a little tube in it that goes down into the subcutaneous tissue. Both of these things have to be changed out every 3 days. But if you had these things operating together, then the CGM could do what the cells of the pancreas do for us non-diabetics. It would detect when the sugar's going up, and it would send a message over to the pump, and the pump would send the sugar out, to send the insulin into the patient. Everybody would be perfectly healthy. Okay, that's what the Artificial Pancreas Project is, and I need acronyms, and I call this the PAP, because it's a big concept, and we need to talk about it. All right, but now Coke dyes is number 2 in here. And maybe this is probably the time, it probably is the time I need to tell you an emotionally moving story. I'm a guy who likes to communicate, and I practice on everybody. I've been practicing this. My friends have probably heard me talk about this more times than they want to think about. And that's why I can talk about it without notes. But I mentioned it to a friend of mine whose name is Richard Harris. That's not his real name. But Richard, as soon as I told him about this, he said, "Caleb, you know, our daughter, Rachel, lost a roommate to this in October, 3 months ago." And I said, "Tell me more." He said, she's Rachel's a student at Brigham Young University. She and 4 other girls shared an apartment complex. One of them had diabetes, and her name, I've given her the name Amanda Inman. Amanda Inman's mother's name is Andrea. Those are all pseudonyms. And her father's name is Edward. Well, I told Richard I need to talk to her parents. I need to know more about this. And he said, I'll be glad to get you in touch with Rachel. Well, it took a couple of weeks. Rachel called me and said, I've got the telephone numbers of both of her mother and her father. And about April 1st of this year, 2013, I placed calls to both of them and left messages on their voicemails. I didn't hear anything from them for 3 weeks, and I thought, okay, they lost their daughter 6 months ago. They're still going through grief about this. I can't blame them for not calling me back. But her mother called me 3 weeks later. And it turns out Andrea is a very talented woman, very good communicator. She called and left word for me at the office and said, I can talk to you if you call me back for the next 30 minutes. I've got an important meeting in 30 minutes. I'll have to break it off after that. I called her immediately. She told me all the story about Amanda's death. And it does turn out that Amanda had a lot of other complications other than diabetes, but she had developed diabetes at age 11 and then developed adrenal insufficiency, which is Addison's disease, very severe, very, very rare condition, when she was about 17 and almost died from it then. It took the doctors over a year to diagnose her and treat her. And then about 2 years before her death, she developed hypothyroidism. She was snake bit 3 times. But on top of all that, she was trying to be out on her own. She was 21 years old when she died. She was trying to do things without Mama and Daddy's intervention, and she didn't do the right things. Code Dyes would have saved her life if she had bought into the program. Now, how does it work? Code Dyes is really a combination of information technology. Let's go with black one for one. Yeah. IT, information technology, and via the internet, INTER, internet, and cell phone, smartphones, smartphone apps. Smartphone app, one app, okay? There might be more than one. And an alarm service, which works very much like a burglar alarm service, to which the diabetic subscribes and contracts. And it works, you've seen the glucometer, and I don't have a cell phone here, but let's assume somebody got a cell phone they can hand me. No, I got one here in my pocket. This is not a smartphone, but if you look this up, glucometer connected to a smartphone on Google, you'll find them. They're out there. And they've been designed for the purpose of making it easier for the diabetics who, when they read their sugars, have the sugars recorded in their cell phone and be able to go to their doctor and have him plug it into his computer and have 120 readings for a month. All that's very valuable to him. It's important. But it's not near as valuable as knowing what is the patient's sugar acutely. When is it being letting the right people know when the sugar goes down right now, not 2 weeks from now when you go to the doctor. Amanda died because she had not notified the girls in her room how sick she was and how much she needed their help. It turned out that she lived a short distance from Provo, which is where Brigham Young University is. She was going home every other weekend. A weekend came up. She would go home on a Thursday and come back late on Sunday night. And all of her roommates thought she'd gone home that weekend. She was in her room. And the family thought she was at school. And she was there at school and okay. And when then the family came to check on her on Sunday night when they hadn't heard from her, they came in and they found her dead in her room. Classic dead in bed story. Grim. Code Dyes works with 3 components. One of them, it works this way. I'm convinced that the endocrinologists for 50 years, or however long they've been in this business, have been trying to set it up so the patient is able to sleep through the night. And if Code Dyes, the first principle of Code Dyes is give up on that idea. If you have relatively unstable diabetes, brittle diabetes, the thing for you to do is treat yourself like your mother treated you when you were a little kid. If she could take care of you, she wakes you up in the middle of your sleep period, in the middle of the night, if you're sleeping at night. And if you're somebody who works in the daytime, works at night and sleeps in the daytime, sometime in the middle of your sleep period, you need to wake up and check your sugar. Fine. Now, suppose, and as long as you're able to do it and think clearly, you're fine. But how does it save you in the event you get into problems? It saves you. Are you pointing right in my face? Okay. By virtue of the fact that you've made an agreement with somebody in the alarm service to call in at 3 o'clock in the morning, and if you don't call in at 3 o'clock in the morning, they know that you didn't call in, and they call you, and not only they call you, they call a series of people who you have selected, who you can count on to come and knock on your door and get you out of trouble. And by get you out of trouble, wake you up, give you some sugar, talk you into eating the sugar. And if you can't talk you into eating the sugar, I've come up with an idea. Either get you the care you need and save your life. So that's the way the system, that's the IT internet. And when I talked to a friend of mine about this system, who's an IT expert, he said, Caleb, I believe there are high school students who could write a smartphone app that would do all this thing right in the phone. And I'm sure he's right. He's a very bright guy. So this system can be developed to run off of an app on a cell phone that calls back to itself, and if that doesn't work, then it starts calling people who have already agreed to come bail this guy out, come rescue him. At first I thought about calling 911. Yes, calling 911 is a possibility and certainly should be a part of the plan, but you can't rely on 911 to do all this, because if this system gets accepted in the degree that I'd like to see it accepted, the EMS services are going to get overwhelmed with all these AWOL diabetics who forget to check who don't wake up or forget to make the call or sleep through their alarm or whatever they might be doing and not make the call. Okay. That gets it. Now, the biggest thing that we need to talk about, and if I'd had my druthers, I would have jumped right here. It's this red box down here. Because when you start talking about developing smartphones and you start talking about alarm systems, these are all complicated processes that involve medical legal issues, administrative issues, and business issues before people are going to make this kind of effort to put all this thing into effect. They're going to need to know how many of the diabetics would really use this program if they did it. Now there's other sides to this Code Dyes. This thing, what I just described to you, is the night watch part of the program. There's actually 3 parts to Code Dyes. Let's call them A, B, and C. So part A, if we've got green, part A is something I haven't talked about yet, but if any of you diabetics have ever been to a diabetic camp, it's a diabetic camp-like experience, but it's year-round. Because what you do is you get a group of people together with an internet program, something like GoToMeeting, and if you look up meeting software, you'll get a PC Mag review of about 10 different kinds of GoToMeeting softwares, and I would be very surprised and terribly disappointed if there wasn't a way either here, maybe it could be done, I'm sure, on Facebook. But anyway, get a group of patients together who are all diabetic, but are close to the same age group. 10-year-old kids don't need to be linked up with 45-year-old adults. They need to be linked up with children close to their ages. And they need to be able to communicate with each other about the ups and downs of their diabetic life and how all the tricks of the trade that they're using in order to manage things. They need to link up with a diabetic camp-like thing, which is really a peer group, support group. But the peer group, this A group, are all diabetics. The B group is the night watch group, and that's what we just talked about. But the problem is, my experience is most diabetics who get into trouble don't get into trouble at night. They get into trouble in the clear light of day. How? Making a simple arithmetic problem with calculating the amount of insulin they're supposed to give themselves. And it can happen very easily because they're having to do it all day long. They're having to count up the amount of carbs that they've got to be using, figure out their insulin dose, give themselves the insulin, and then the next thing that throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing is there are a lot of things that can change their insulin needs. If they get an infection, their insulin needs change. If they're more active than they usually were, like they just do more work, get out in the hot sun, then their insulin needs change too. And when those things are all bouncing around, it is extremely difficult to keep your sugar well controlled. So your day watch group has to do, whether or not they're going to do the day watch, has a lot to do with how shy the diabetic is, how comfortable he is, because here's the program. That's what would have saved Amanda's life. Amanda needed to be able to be telling everybody around her, look, I'm a bad diabetic. I need your help. I need you to save my life. Don't leave me alone more than about 2 hours. Come in there. If I'm working shoulder to shoulder, these are your work associates. These are the people you're going to school with, the people you touch, who watch you 24/7. And interacting with them. This is what I call alkalizing your diabetes. That's another acronym. Alkalize the diabetes. Alkalize, and this I think will help in using language to talk about, or Joe Wilsonize your diabetes. When I was 13 years old, the house next door changed hands, and the new people coming in were a man named Joe Wilson. That's not his real name. I've got a different name. Joe, and his wife's name was Mary. And Joe and Mary came over to my parents' house. It was a summer day. The movers were still in the front yard of their house. And Joe and Mary sat down, and Joe said, I need to tell everybody here that since we're going to be neighbors and we're going to likely be seeing each other a lot, and it turned out Joe was one of the closest friends I've ever had, my parents ever had, Joe and Mary. But he said, I've been an alcoholic since I was 13 years old, and I've been sober for 6 years, and my sobriety means more to me, as much to me as my wife, and my wife, Mary, has been a big part in helping me get sober and stay sober as long as I have. But I can't take the first drink. I mean, that's requires a degree of abandonment of privacy. And that's what you got to do if you're going to use the Day Watch program. You're going to have to reach out there to the people around you and say, bail me out, watch me, take care of me. Finally, one of the things that I've thought about here, there's a there's a drug called glucagon. And glucagon is an emergency source of sugar when the insulin has gone way south. And I feel that people who are in this Code Guys program ought to be carrying a syringe, a device for administering glucagon that all of his friends know about, so if they find him acting squirrely and they can't talk, he won't talk to them, they can say to their other friends, come on, let's go for his glucagon gun. We know he's got it strapped on a belt under his clothes, and they just pull up his pants, pull up his shirt, and there it is. And it's in a form that they can pull that thing off of his belly, cock it, take it and pop it in the side of his pants leg, right through his leg, and shoot the glucagon into him. Watch him for 2 minutes, and if he turns around, then call his family, and if he doesn't turn around, call 911. So that's the Code Guys program. Now, what's the first thing that needs to be done? A survey needs to be put out. Something like this lecture that I've just given needs to be presented to a representative number of the diabetic population. Every time I talk about type 1 diabetics, they say, Doc, this sounds great. But now we need to document that, because the development of this is not going to be cheap. There's going to be a lot of people who are going to have to be involved in it. Now, I'm a graduate of Vanderbilt University, and I get this magazine every 3 months asking them, informing me about what's going on at Vanderbilt. And there's a man here in this book who I have felt might be very influential in being able to put this whole thing together. And I refer to him as Dr. Frank Foster. He's an engineer, and he came to mind and has been in my mind a great deal. He's one of the main people I would like to have watch this video, think about it for 5 or 6 months, however long it takes him to figure out whether or not he wants to be involved in it, because the content of that article indicated he's a very aggressive man when it comes to trying to solve major problems that are out there in the community, and certainly this is a big one. I guess I've covered the whole thing. The first thing that I think needs to be done is I will make this lecture available to you in print form. The full text of it will be available, so you can go back over what I've had to say, pick it apart, think about it, ask questions. How involved do I want to be in this long term? I'm 74 years old, folks. And quite frankly, I'm really, in the last few days, I'm particularly, my focus is shifting, because I'm threatened with a heart problem for the first time in my life. And there's a very good chance I'm going to say, I don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. It's too big a job from now on. This has got to be done by younger people with more chutzpah and drive and energy than I've got left in my personal or professional life. But it's been a pleasure to try to put this together for you, and I hope I've done something, achieved some degree of clarity, that I've partially accomplished the task of compressing, taking you through a journey into diabetes, and giving you a handle on what it's like to be a diabetic today, and what the hopes may be for improving things in the future. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.